Hi, everybody. Bill De La Cruz here with the Origination Point podcast. Glad you're listening. And I wanted to let you know I'm going to start a series called Straight Talk on DEI. So, for those of you who don't know what that means diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, I've been a practitioner in the DEI space. I say space because it's a very broad arena and not as narrow as some would like us to believe. And in that time, I've been effective and impactful at providing a space for people to have real conversations, regardless of their perspective, and create understanding of what others think and have topics about the impacts of race and gender and bias and stereotypes and how all of those things affect our ability to show up our most authentic self and to see other people as their most authentic self. And as a practitioner, I've seen some of my colleagues in the field who have done a lot of damage to people. And I can see how, from that perspective, that people might be afraid of this work. And one of those ways is I remember I went to a workshop, it had to have been over 15 years ago. And there was about 200 people in the room, and the facilitator was about 8:30 in the morning, came out on the stage and said, "Good morning, everyone. As soon as you all admit you are racist, we'll begin the program." And I sat there a bit dumbstruck, thinking, what did I just hear him say? Did I just hear him say he wanted me to call myself a racist? And I could feel and see the shock in the whole room as people turned their heads and some people got up and left. And I went to this workshop not only to hear what the speaker had to say, I also wanted to participate in the way that they said it. So have an experience to see how this work is actually facilitated. And of course, I put that in my what never to do column. Never start a workshop telling people they should admit that they're anything, because that's wrong and judgmental. And so over the years of facilitating this work, and I'm going to tell you what this work is because I think there's a lot of false narratives around what the work of diversity, equity, inclusion actually looks like. It's just important to know that we've got to have a conversation of this because what's happening through legislation with DEI efforts, it says GOP backs bills targeting diversity efforts. That's a column I'm going to go through today. And yet the reality is that Democrats are also backing bills targeting diversity efforts. It's just that one thinks they're doing the right things and the other person thinks the other group's doing the wrong thing. So both groups think that they're correct and think that the other one is incorrect in their approach. So neither political party is better or worse. I think they both run the risk of doing damage to an effort that was never created to be political or to divide people in the way that it's being used. And for me, that's an important thing to know and understand, that the work that I've grown and built and created for myself, and in turn engaging with people that I facilitate with, has never been rooted in divisiveness or isolationism or telling people that they are anything other than a human being who's trying to do the best that they can. And this push to legislate, especially to legislate from fear, without a clear understanding of what DEI work is and what its possibilities are, I think we're being really short-sighted and we're just operating from an emotionally triggered space and then making a decision. And that's not a great place to make a decision from. And rooting it in fear from either side, fear that it's going to be taken away or fear that it's going to be limited, either one feels the same. And both parties are doing the same thing to each other and then to us. And I just think it's time to speak up to this because I don't hear a counter narrative in our country talking about the importance of this approach when done with fidelity. That's a big piece of this. There is a way to do it incorrectly. And that way is to label people, judge people, shame people, tell people they're the problem, dehumanize, denigrate, or in any way isolate somebody because you don't agree with them. When you have that experience in a DEI training, you experience a very poor facilitation of that work. Because if you feel worse when you leave than when you came in, that's an issue. And I used to ask people that. How many of you out there listening have ever been to a diversity training where you left feeling worse than you came in? And that could be anything. You're just emotional, overcharged, angry, frustrated, discontent, whatever emotion you bring into it. And I stopped asking that question because 90% of people would raise their hands of all identities, all backgrounds, all races. And so the approach of shaming people is not the approach that is infidelity with DEI work. That's an approach that some people take. And I don't fault people for what they do or how they choose to deliver content, even if it's similar to mine. I just have a choice as to how I'm going to deliver it. And so what you're hearing is my choice, also rooted in 20 years of engaging with people from every background you could ever imagine across this country and across the world. And there's a way to make a connection with people, whether we are in lockstep agreement, which I rarely find myself with anybody, or we have diametrically opposing perspectives, life experiences, and cultural values. There still is a place for connection. And so I want to address some of the fear-based approaches, some of the things that I'm hearing and reading and seeing. And so the article that I'm going to reference today, I'll just have to say in all honesty, I think it's real. And the reality of the world we live in today is it could have been generated by AI and everything put in there. I don't know. So I'm going to presume that it's a true story because it references governors in a variety of states, both Republican and Democrat, which I'm not going to name each governor. I just want to talk to the approach that some of these states are taking and the fact that it's both Democrats and Republicans. So I'm sorry, nobody's any better. When we're trying to use DEI efforts to legislate, well, I'm going to share with you what some of the things are in just a minute. So in one state, diversity initiatives would be defunded or banned from universities and other public institutions under a slate of bills pending in Republican-led legislatures. And the end of that sentence says, with some lawmakers counting on the issue resonating with voters in this election year. I'm sorry, but DEI is not something that should be an issue for voters because it's not something you can legislate. And you can legislate all you want from either end of the spectrum, Democrat through Republican, and it still won't change people's willingness or desire to talk about connection and to talk about community and to talk about relationships and to talk about how we might look or think different and yet we're still part of the same community. So how do we treat each other with dignity and respect? And so that's one thing. DEI has become a political tool, and fear is the way that it's being driven. People are being socialized to believe you should be afraid of this work. And again, I'm talking about my own perspective after facilitating this for 20 years. And so when I say the work, I mean the work of becoming more aware of the impact that my language and my behavior has on other people. I mean being able to own my actions and to apologize or make amends if I have a misstep, to be able to create a connection with somebody, whether they look like me or think like me or act like me, that I can find some way to connect, and that we lead with relationships. To me, that's the essence of facilitating diversity, equity, inclusion work is leading with relationships and getting to know the story behind the sentence or the person or whatever it is that I'm experiencing, because every perspective has a story. And so absent the story from that person, we run the risk of making up a story. So that's why it's so important to be inquisitive also, to be able to ask questions and tell me more about that. Like, tell me more how DEI became an issue that's resonating with voters this year. Because for 20 years, I've been doing this work and nobody's ever asked me about it or said, hey, what about that DEI work? How important is it? And now it's an issue in an election year. And there's no point counterpoint about what are false narratives and what are some truths to the approach to diversity, equity, inclusion work. Can't live with that. So I'm going to do my best to create a counter narrative to these. And then each one of you who watches this or listens to this, you all have to decide what you want to believe and what you want to do. I have no control over that. I do have control over thinking about what's the conversation that we need to be having. And I can tell you, we need to have a conversation about the effectiveness and impact of politicizing diversity, equity, inclusion work, or connection work, as I like to call it. And so one of the bills, which actually I don't disagree with, I don't think you can legislate it, is about restricting, which, again, if we had a conversation and decided that certain things we needed to restrict would be one thing, but when we lock stock put everything into one pot and want to restrict everything, then we're not really having a dialogue, because some of this stuff actually works. So the other part of it says it would require public disclosure when you're doing DEI work, which I actually agree with that, because there are a lot of practitioners who go out there and basically put all white people in the same boat and say, you're racist because of the system and because of something that happened hundreds of years ago, which is wrong. It's a false narrative. To be white in 2024 doesn't mean that you're responsible for what happened 400, 500 years ago in this country or in this planet. My ancestors have been around for 400 years, 500 years. Since the 1700s, I've traced back. So should I go back 500 years and say, oh my gosh, uncle, you did this, now I'm responsible for it? I can't do that. The only thing I can do is mitigate the outcomes of where we are in 2024. And it's unfair of me, and it's very exclusive to look at what we're looking at, especially around race, and pick another race and tell them you're the problem, and now we're going to marginalize you. To me, that logically doesn't make sense. And as a practitioner, I think that if what I've been fighting for is to not be labeled and put in a group and treated as if I am the group, then I can't treat another group that way. I can't look at a group of people and say, because of whatever identity you have, you are the problem. I can't do that personally because I don't think it's right. And that's what I believe is being infidelity with the approach to diversity, equity, inclusion work. The way that I don't think you're infidelity is when a practitioner goes out there and actually says those things to their audience. That's wrong. And so part of this, in part of my desire in sharing this with you, is to not only allow for you to get a different narrative, also to think about a different approach to this work. Because let's admit it, folks, we live in the most divisive time ever that I've experienced in my years on the planet. The whole world is imploding. And if you're not seeing it, then I'm not sure where you are or what you're doing. Our leaders are not collaborating. People are hurting and killing other people. Our children are traumatized. And we're spending all of our energy talking about the legislation of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, when the people in your families, in your community, in your organizations, all need support. And so I think we're at this interesting time in our evolution as a society where we have to decide, what's the value of my neighbor? What's the value of connection? What's the value of community? Outside of me only having community and connection with people who look like me, think like me, or act like me. To me, that's a pretty boring world, because I would never hear any dissenting opinions. I would never have a counter narrative that I could talk about. And so, as we approach this conversation, all I'm here to do is to ask you to think about this stuff. Like I said, everybody who's listening and watching, y'all have to decide what you want to do. I've chosen that I can either get into this fear base and put up a battle or have a fight with everybody, or I can figure out a way to make a connection with you. And that's what I've chosen to do. So I'm going to share one more thought, and then I'm going to read another piece of this article. So I've traveled across the country in the last 10 years, worked in every ideological part of the country, from the South to the Midwest to the Northwest to the Northeast, Pacific Northwest, West, North, South, all over the country. I'll just say that. And regardless of people's political ideology, from Democrat to Republican, I was able to make a connection with a majority of those folks. And I say a majority because in any space I'm in, there's always 3 or 4 people who have closed their mind off to any possibility, and they are there and not engaged. They're there and wanting to be disruptive. And I do know that those things are factual because I've experienced them and I've lived through them. I've had people read their paper really loudly for 8 hours during a workshop that I did, and I had to stay focused on the other 25 people that were in the room. So the idea of fear is going to challenge us all to shift our mindset and start to think about what might the impact be if we weren't being socialized to being afraid about this. So let me find another quote here. So this one says, Democrats have filed about 24 bills in 11 states that would require or promote diversity initiatives, covering a broad spectrum, including measures to reverse certain bans in certain states and require other states to consider things in their curriculum, for instance. And so what we're doing now are putting through legislation that we think counters the Republican opponents, saying the programs are discriminatory and promote left-wing ideology. And so the political structures are pitting us against each other. And I'm not sure to what end. There's some political gain for them without ever understanding what the impact is of diversity, equity, inclusion work, how connecting it can be, how creation of community it could be. Maybe there's a fear that we won't be divided anymore. There's a whole structure around the politics of division. If we're fighting with each other, we never come together to work with the politicians to create legislation that might actually have an impact. And so when I think about all of this DEI work, both sides of the political aisle are creating fear and false narratives, telling people things that are not real. And so both sides are looking at this and wanting to meet this window, as some have called it, of DEI with a policy agenda. And it's all rooted in don't do this, don't talk about race, don't talk about bias, don't talk about pick any topic, don't say anything that might hurt somebody's feelings. Now, while I'm all for not hurting people's feelings and not antagonizing people, the essence of really talking about DEI in terms of the work is we have to have these conversations. We have to talk about the impact of race in our systems because it exists. We have to talk about the impact of gender in our systems, or socioeconomic status, or immigration status. All of those play a role in the systemic structure of our country. And that conversation is getting lost to this idea of critical race theory and bringing critical race theory into schools and organizations, which I'm not really sure what that means. I would love to talk to any person or politician to tell me what it means when you use the term or think that critical race theory is being brought in to schools. Because critical race theory is a research paper that was written to look at the impacts of race in systems. And it said that systemic racism is inherent in a lot of our systems. Now, if I were to reframe that to maybe make it so that it's clearer for me, I would say, how do people of different racial categories, how are they impacted by the systems in America? Political system, economics, healthcare, policing, education, all of those systems. What role does race play in terms of outcomes, differentiated outcomes? It's a real conversation. I think the fear part of this is that there's been this other false narrative that if you are talking about or promoting critical race theory, you are saying that all white people are racist, and if you're white, you're an oppressor, and if you're not white, you're oppressed. That's a made-up story. If y'all want to read critical race theory, it's quite an interesting read. I've read it a few times. Nowhere in that document does it say, and this means that all white people are racist. It doesn't say that anywhere. That is a false narrative that I've heard in more than one place. That if you're doing whatever that means, again, I don't know what that means, but when you're doing critical race theory, I've heard politicians say you're automatically saying that all white people are racist. And that's not true. Even white people are affected by race. And so what we need to do is talk about what are the impacts of these identities in having differentiated outcomes that lead to success. And success is defined as achieving your goals, whether that is for quality health care or housing that you can afford or quality food choices or parks or whatever it is, recreation. Everybody has different desires. And so that's what we need to talk about. And we are spending a lot of time talking about DEI and getting rid of DEI versus what are ways that we can do it really well. So, and I'm not even sure when I hear this phrase of promoting a left-wing ideology, someone has to define that for me because I need to understand it. because we're presuming that anybody with that title, which is a judgment and a stereotype, so I'm not sure who that label actually fits. I'm even more unclear about what does it mean and who can tell me specifically. And if I ask 10 people, will they all give me the same answer? Because if they all give me a different answer, then all I'm hearing is a perspective of what left-wing ideology is. Even the opposite is true, where GOP wants to banish. Well, what does that mean? There's a conversation there also. I'm not sure exactly what are we banishing. Are we banishing people, programs, conversation? And I get all of these headlines are written by somebody in a copy house, so it may not actually be what's actually happening, because it's in everybody's favor to keep us in fear. So even the way that it's written up in the media perpetuates division. And so decisions can't be made in fear. And oh, I know the other thing that I read, which I thought was kind of interesting. In another state, they want to control the universities. And the quote is, and so I think that's another thing that's providing a growing impetus to get our state universities under control. So, how have we digressed as a society that now it's okay to control something or someone? And whatever happened to collaborate? How do we collaborate with universities and organizations and have a real conversation about tell me what you're doing? What is your approach? If your approach is demeaning, dehumanizing, denigrating, or in any way exclusionary to anyone, then I would say that approach needs to be gotten rid of because it's not supportive of the people in the school or the organization. And so those things just can't happen. It causes people to not trust. I can't tell you how many organizations I've worked in over the years where they will start their conversation with me by telling me 2 years ago, which breaks my heart, 2 years ago, but 2 years ago, someone came to our organization and called everyone a racist and everyone disengaged, our white staffers and our folks of color, everyone disengaged, and nobody trusted the work anymore. And we've tried to introduce it again over the years, and everybody just says, not doing it. So they call me 2 years later, and I had to spend 6 months building trust with them, just building enough trust to say, I can guide you on this journey and not beat you up. And that breaks my heart because it means that somebody did demean them, somebody did dehumanize them. And that's not what DEI work is about. And when I see it politicized like it is, that to me is dehumanizing. So if you want to know, because it's taking something that I believed in pretty much my whole life, that I've practiced personally my whole life, that I've practiced and shared professionally for maybe half my life. And it's being wrapped around this stereotype that there's something wrong with it. There's something wrong with talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. There's nothing wrong with talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. There are really ineffective ways to facilitate that conversation. And those practitioners are out there. I think right now, and I'm being a little bit conservative, this is the DEI space has grown into a $10 billion business. And internationally, it's even more. And when I first got into it, it was very, very small. And so my goal here is to ask you to think more about the messages that you're taking in about diversity, equity, inclusion. Just find out more information. And I'm going to continue to share my perspective over my podcast because I think it's important for us to talk about it. Oh, another quote was, Not everyone on either party, Republicans or Democrats, are united about which governmental approach is best suited to eliminate DE&I. Sorry, folks, but you will never eliminate DE&I. You can create all the laws you want about it. You can pass all the legislative bills, and DEI will never go away because, well, as long as human beings are here, because we'll always be diverse, we'll always be different, and we'll always want to have a sense of value and connection. You can't take that away. So let's be really clear. What we're legislating is behavior and practice. We're not legislating a way of being because that's rooted in every human being. And you can't tell me, those of you who are out there listening or watching, that you don't have some group that you have a sense of being with, a sense of value, a sense of inclusion. And so it doesn't matter your perspective or your ideology. It only matters that we see ourselves connected in that way of wanting to feel valued, wanting to have a sense of worth, wanting to have a passion to do something. And so I think it's really important for us to start to become more aware of what we're talking about. We're in the DEI space. So let me see if there's any other quotes. Well, one person in legislation called using diversity statements in hiring bordering on evil, which I've never had to fill out a diversity statement. And I don't know if I'm supportive of them because a diversity statement doesn't really do anything. And statements are just pieces of paper. They're just words on pieces of paper. And after George Floyd was murdered, many organizations and schools and districts and universities across the country created equity statements and hired a DEI person. And here we are years later, and those haven't changed anything. Equity statements are just words on a piece of paper. And to me, they're not of much value because there's no actualization in it. So unless it's actualized into something that's tangible, they're just words on a piece of paper. And now we see the opposite is happening. Equity statements are going away. DEI people are losing their jobs or losing their budgets. And that goes to, what was our plan with this? What was our approach? What was our outcome? What were our goals? I don't think there was any strategic planning around what a DEI person is supposed to do, who, by the way, are mostly people of color. And so our approach has to be more well thought out in terms of this. And I'm not going to allow it to be legislated away through false narratives. And so I think that's why it's important for you to just think about what I'm sharing with you, to have conversations that are more well informed. I'll put it that way. Because we've gotten the political agenda. I don't think we've gotten the human approach about the connections I've seen people make, the different people who thought they had nothing in common that found out they have so much more in common. And so, all of these approaches that someone else referred to DEI as, they'd only just begun to remove cancerous DEI practices. That's pretty extreme. And yet I still agree that there are a lot of people who are doing a lot of damage to people through the way that they approach DEI work. So I do agree with that. I don't think they're cancerous. I do think that there are some people who should never be doing this work because they want to blame, shame, and judge people. And they don't know how to handle emotional energy when it gets riled up, which, as a facilitator, you have to be really comfortable with other people's emotions. I have to ask myself constantly, How comfortable am I today sitting in the fire of somebody else's emotion? Because I know that wherever I'm at, I'm asking people to dip into being vulnerable. And truly, DEI work is connecting, it's vulnerable, it's emotional, it's challenging, and it's some of the most rewarding work I've ever done. And I've seen people who disliked each other in the morning and in the afternoon. They had made so many connections. So that's what I want to leave you with, is just to think about, no matter how different your neighbor might look, or the person in your grocery store, or the person you work with, they have a story and they have a perspective. And the one thing I have learned over the last 20 plus years of engaging in this approach is that there is so much more that connects us than divides us. And I will say that typically around the country, it's rooted in some level of family or faith. If I can have a conversation with people, faith being everything from being an atheist to going to church every day and everything in between. And if I can make a connection with somebody rooted in family or faith, and I'll remind you that a connection just means that we have something in common. It could be just that we practice our faith, regardless of what it's called. That's a commonality. When I make that connection, then that brings us closer together. And you no longer are the other. And I remember a quote by a high school student when I was in Washington State doing some work with a district there. And he was a senior about ready to graduate, and he was talking to all of his peers. And he said, there are some values and beliefs that y'all have in this room that I don't agree with, that I don't think I'll ever agree with because they're different values and beliefs than I have. And I just want you to know that that's what I think. And I still want to treat you with dignity and respect. So this young man had the greatest quote of the whole weekend that I was there talking to adults and students, basically telling everybody, I know we don't have the same belief system. I know we don't have the same value system. And you're a part of my community, so I'm going to treat you with dignity and respect. So think about that after you're done here. What does it mean for you to be treated with dignity and respect? How are people talking to you? How are they interacting with you? How are you sharing? What are you talking about? What's going on up here in your head as you're interacting with people? So that's your work if you choose to do it. I'm going to give us all something to think about. So the thought of in between this and the next podcast is, what does it mean for you to be treated with dignity and respect? And what does it mean for you to treat somebody else with dignity and respect? It's been great having this chat with you, and we will put in a link to our app and a way to engage in a community conversation to carry this on if you're interested in doing that. And just a reminder, in our community conversation, I'm happy to have a conversation. I will not entertain communication that's demeaning, dehumanizing, or denigrating, because that's the way I want to be treated. That's how I treat others, with dignity and respect, is to make sure that none of us is dehumanized. And I'm not perfect at it, so it's a constant practice. So we'll see you again next time. And remember, keep growing.